Namaste and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishna Ishwaram. Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadattatam Bhuvi Grinanti Ye Bhurida Jana. So this morning we have come to Monday, June 25th, 1883, and that is on page 256. So it says, Sri Ramakrishna was at Balaram Bose's house in Calcutta. Rakal and M were seated near him. The master was in ecstasy. He conversed with the devotees in an abstracted mood. Master, let me assure you that a man can realize his inner self through sincere prayer, but to the extent that he has the desire to enjoy worldly objects, his vision of the self becomes obstructed. I'm going to read several paragraphs and then come back to discuss the whole thing because it's all tied together. M. Yes, sir. You always ask us to plunge into God. Master joyously. Yes, that's it. Let me tell you that the realization of the self is possible for all without any exception. M. That is true, sir, but God is the doer. He works through different beings in different ways, according to their capacity to manifest the divine. God gives to some full spiritual consciousness, and others he keeps in ignorance. Master. No, that is not so. One should pray to God with a longing heart. God certainly listens to prayer if it is sincere. There is no doubt about it. And so this is a very important passage, and one that I often refer to, though usually in lectures when I refer to it, I have somehow fixed in my mind that it was from 1884, but no, it was 1883 that this passage occurs, as we see here, of course, June 25th, 1883. And so Sri Ramakrishna is in a state of ecstasy, but with enough outward consciousness to speak to the devotees. So it says that he's speaking in an abstracted mood. So that we can only imagine how he would have spoken when he was only partially conscious of the world, enough still to speak, but haltingly. So he says that let me assure you that a man can realize his inner self through sincere prayer. So the inner self, the Atman, can be realized through sincere prayer. First of all, that's an interesting statement of Sri Ramakrishna, because one would think through sincere prayer one can realize God. And of course one can. But here he's emphasizing that one can realize the inner self through prayer. So through prayer, the inner self is awakened. Um, but then he says, but to the extent that he has the desire to enjoy worldly objects, his vision of the self becomes obstructed. So one, through sincere prayer, can realize the inner self, but to the degree that we have a desire for enjoyment, to that degree, that vision is obstructed. And so the master, M says, yes, sir, you always ask us to plunge into God. Yes, that was perhaps the central teaching of Sri Ramakrishna that you get from the gospel is over and over again in various ways, encouraging people to plunge into God, to dive into God. And so the master is delighted that M has said this. And so he says joyously, yes, that's it. That's it. And then this next part is very important. Let me tell you that the realization of self is possible for all without any exception. So here, usually Sri Ramakrishna, you find in the Gita, he's always talking about the fact that some people have more power, some people have less power. There are differences of manifestations here in this world of variety. And that some people find it easy to plunge into God. Some people find it very difficult, and some are not even interested. They never even turn their mind that way. So here he's saying that it's possible for everyone to realize the self without any exception. The realization of self is possible for all without any exception. So M agrees and says, yes, yes, sir, that is true, but... And so here M gives his understanding of what Sri Ramakrishna usually would teach. But God is the doer. He works through different beings in different ways, again, recognizing the diversity here. He works through different beings in different ways according to their capacity to manifest the divine. God gives to some full spiritual consciousness, and others he keeps in ignorance. And the master says, no, that is not so. So that's the surprise here, because M was basically repeating what Sri Ramakrishna would often say. But here Sri Ramakrishna says, no, that's not so, that the realization of the self is possible for all without any exception. And he says that through sincere prayer, anyone can realize the self. So, Master, no, that is not so. One should pray to God with a longing heart. God certainly listens to prayer if it is sincere. There is no doubt about it. And so again, one of the central teachings of Sri Ramakrishna that you find throughout the gospel and other recorded teachings of his is the value of prayer and the virtue and the value of prayer, that one should learn to talk with God, he says, learn to speak with God. Pray to God with a yearning heart, he says over and over again. And so here he's saying that through sincere prayer, one can realize the self, the inner self. And and saying that that is possible for all without any exception. So not that those who are, there's some who God keeps in ignorance, no. So then a devotee says, yes, sir, there is this high consciousness in us, therefore we must pray. So he's saying that because we have the sense of I, we need to pray. That is, we have a sense of being a distinct person, and so we relate to God as one person to another. And so the master doesn't reply to that. That was just a stray statement made by devotee that the master lets go. And then he says to him, a man should reach the nitya, the absolute. The nitya means the eternal, the unchanging. A man should reach the nitya, the absolute, by following the trail of the lila, the relative. It is like reaching the roof by the stairs. After realizing the absolute, he should climb down to the relative and live on that plane in the company of devotees, charging his mind with the love of God. This is my final and most mature opinion. So here, this also is very important, and it fits in with what he said before in the first part of this conversation, that one should reach the nitya, the absolute, but how to reach the nitya? One way, of course, is through just denying the lila, denying the relative universe, saying not this, and trying to pull one's consciousness back into its source, which is the self, by forgetting and giving up all of this. But here he's saying, as he often would say, that one should reach the absolute through the relative. That is, the relative universe is a manifestation of the nitya. The lila is a manifestation of the nitya. The changeful universe, and a universe of diversity, is a manifestation of the non-dual reality. As Sri Ramakrishna would say, give the metaphor of a snake at rest and a snake in motion. The snake at rest is like the absolute, but the same snake in motion is like the relative. That it's the same snake. And so it's the same reality that is both absolute, unchanging, still, tranquil, and dynamic, as the same reality becomes this dynamic universe without losing its absolute nature. It's the same reality in two different states. The analogy of the serpent is still and in motion is a very, very apt illustration, because everything here is vibration, and the motion of a snake is like a wave-like motion. It moves as if it were following a wave pattern. And so everything here is vibratory by nature. Light is vibration, sound is vibration, subatomic particles are vibration, everything is vibration. And so thoughts are vibrations. So a man should reach the nitya, the absolute, by following the trail of the lila. That is, by going through the lila, not becoming infatuated with the surface of things, but going into the heart of things. And so one of the things he probably meant, though he doesn't express it that way here, by following the lila, is to follow the trail of God. That is, the absolute Brahman is beyond personality, beyond relationship, completely non-dual, unchanging. There's no question of my relating myself to Brahman. Brahman is the absolute. But that same Brahman, when it appears as this universe, then that same Brahman appears to us as God. That is, that's a poor way of putting it, but we're restricted to the weaknesses of human language. It's a poor way of putting it, that the absolute appears to us as God, because that way of putting it, which Vedanta does, makes it sound like God is an illusion. There's just an appearance like an illusion. And we just use God in order to get back to the absolute, and then we forget about that illusion that was God, that we were assuming for the time being for the sake of practice. But no, God is the absolute, God is reality. But when we see God from the standpoint of the universe, or when we see the absolute from the standpoint of the universe, we see it as God. And from its own standpoint, it is the absolute. And so Sri Ramakrishna is saying, by following the trail of the lila, the manifestation, which again, part of what he means, at least, and maybe central to what he means, is following the path of God, seeking God. So a man should reach the nitya, the absolute, by following the trail of the lila, the relative. It is like reaching the roof by the stairs. After realizing the absolute, he should climb down to the relative and live on that plane in the company of devotees, charging his mind with the love of God. This is my final and most mature opinion. So unlike Totapuri, his teacher in non-dual Vedanta, who had attained to Nirvikalpa Samadhi, but when he came back to this world, aware of this world, he knew that he was the self, the divine self, but he rejected the world and rejected God as ultimately unreal also. And so Sri Ramakrishna taught him that no, when you see the relative, then God is there also, that the absolute manifests as this very universe, as both God and Jiva. And so when we're in this plane, after even the realization of the self, when we come back, then as Sri Ramakrishna himself did, he established or he didn't have to establish, he kept the loving relationship he had with the Divine Mother before he went into Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and kept that the rest of his life, and lived, as he says here, in the company of devotees. So again, through prayer, he's saying everyone can realize the inner self. So even if you're praying to God, that it awakens the inner self. Now, he's not saying here whether he's talking about the Jivatma or the Paramatma, the individualized consciousness or the supreme absolute Atman, which is one with Brahman. But I would venture to guess, which is always dangerous with someone like Sri Ramakrishna, but I would venture to guess he's speaking about the awakening of the Jivatma, which is the awakening of the inner self, but it's still individualized. Because the devotee seeks to remain in a state of relationship between the Jivatma and the Paramatma, taking the Paramatma as God, and the Jivatma, that is the absolute self, they see is God to whom the Jivatma is related. That the Paramatma is the soul of the soul of the Jivatma. And so it's a relationship, as the Bengal school of Vaishnavism calls it, bheda bheda, non-difference in the midst of difference, or difference in the midst of non-difference. That the soul of the soul, meaning the reality of the soul, is God, but a sense of individuality is maintained, like a drop and the ocean. The drop is nothing but water, but it has the identity of water rather than having the identity of being the ocean. So, however that may be, if one awakens to the Jivatman, not to the Jiva, I'm a Jiva, you're a Jiva. The Jiva means the Jivatman plus body and mind. But the Jivatman itself is pure consciousness, pure divine consciousness, but with a sense of limitation, a sense of being individualized and separate from other Jivatmans and separate from Brahman. And so that whether we're on the path of knowledge or the path of devotion, the awakening of the Jivatma is a extremely important step, a very huge step in the path. When that has happened, much of our trouble in spiritual life is over. If we awaken to the Jivatman, to the pure consciousness within us, which is again individualized, then the path of devotion is simply relating that to God, that I am the part and you are the whole, and I see you now to be the whole. I do as you makest me do. And on the path of knowledge, one seeks to find that the Jivatma, one seeks to go beyond the sense of limitation, to see that the sense of the limitation of the Jivatma, that it's part rather than whole, that itself is caused by by Maya. So it's the Jivatma itself that the Jnani seeks to realize as the Supreme Self. So it's extremely important and a very high step on both paths, the path of devotion and the path of knowledge. So Sri Ramakrishna is saying, at least in my interpretation, he's saying that is awakened, can be awakened by all through sincere prayer. Not that some people can attain to it, some people can't because of past karma, whatever. No, he's saying that everyone can attain it. And again, remember, he's saying this in a state of ecstasy. He was speaking in an abstracted mood, as it says here. So he goes on to say, God has different forms and he sports in different ways. He sports as Ishvara, that is God, Deva, one of the gods, man, and the universe. In every age, he descends to earth in human form as an incarnation to teach people love and devotion. There is the instance of Chaitanya, One can taste devotion and love of God only through his incarnations. Infinite are the ways of God's play, but what I need is love and devotion. I want only the milk. The milk comes through the udder of the cow. The incarnation is the udder. And then M says, the narrator, was Sri Ramakrishna hinting here that he was an incarnation of God? Did he suggest that those who saw him saw God? Did he thus speak about himself when speaking of Chaitanya? So going back, this also very important. This whole day is extremely important. Excuse me. God has different forms. He sports in different ways. He sports as God, Ishvara. He sports as Deva, that is one of the gods. He sports as human being and as the incarnation and as this universe. So God sports in all of these different ways. This whole universe is the sport, the play of God. So he sports in human form as an incarnation in order to teach people love and devotion. So that is the Hindu idea of the incarnation of God. And that's one of the ways in which it differs from the Christian theological idea of the incarnation of God. That God comes as a human being in order to teach love and devotion. And yes, that agrees with the Christian theological position, but that it is a play and that it happens over and over again. That God appears in human form, takes birth in human form, takes on human form, and does so in order to teach us love and devotion. Not for the idea is not that God came for the sins of the world to redeem a fallen world. No, but God comes in human form to dance and to sing and to teach love and devotion and to teach us our own true nature. That our nature is not different from the incarnation's nature. It's just that we are coming up through ignorance, evolving through ignorance, hopefully out of ignorance. And the incarnation comes freely from a state of illumination into human form in order to teach us that we too are that. So he says there's the instance of Chaitanya. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is considered an incarnation of God. Sri Ramakrishna himself considered Sri Chaitanya to be an incarnation of God. And it was assumed by Sri Ramakrishna's devotees that Sri Ramakrishna was the same who came as Sri Chaitanya. The Chaitanya himself had said that he would come again after a few hundred years. And so it's believed that Sri Ramakrishna is the same being who came as Sri Chaitanya and before that as other incarnations of God as well. So he mentions the example of Sri Chaitanya because Sri Chaitanya came to teach love and devotion. One can see that that was the primary purpose in Sri Chaitanya's coming, was to exemplify the perfection of ecstatic love for God and to teach that to others. So he says it's only through the incarnations that we can taste the love of God. So why is that? God is everywhere. We should be able to taste the love of God anywhere. But no, it's the incarnation that manifests it in a perfect degree, in a degree of perfection, which isn't possible to find elsewhere. Yes, one can come to God, one can realize God even without appealing to the incarnation of God. But the incarnation of God makes the love and compassion and grace of God visible. And so Swami Vivekananda used to say that this is the real meaning of Jesus's teaching in the Christian scripture, that no one can come to the Father except by me. So Swamiji interprets that in this way. That means that it's through the incarnation that we can see the love, the truth, the grace, the beauty of God. The incarnation makes it visible. And so we come to God through the Son. I was just reading this morning the reminiscences of Swami Vishuddhananda, who was a past president of the order, a great saintly man who first met Holy Mother in 1905 or 1906. I think it was 1905, when he was 22 or 23 years old. And he says that he went to Jairambati and met the Holy Mother, and that every word of hers, from the first word that she addressed to them, as if she knew him intimately. When he appeared before her, he had never seen her. She had heard nothing about him. He just, in those days, of course, there was no telephone, not even telegraph to a place like Jairambati. So there was no way of sending word that I'm coming, except by letter. And so he just appeared, and Holy Mother treated him as if she had known him for all eternity. And he said from that moment, he said, I can still, when I think of the first words she said to me that were so full of love, dripping with love, he said, that even now when I think of that, I can't stop the tears that stream down my face thinking about that. And he stayed with her that time for a week in Jairambati and said every word she spoke was full of love in a way that he had never experienced. Not even his own mother had that anything approaching that kind of love. So he said that his being was bound to her eternally because of that experience of meeting her. From the first moment of meeting her and her asking him how he was, how his trip was. So again, the incarnation of God manifests that love of God. Swami Premananda used to say that don't think that we were attracted to Sri Ramakrishna because of his glory or because of his knowledge or anything like that, or because he was an incarnation of God. We were attracted simply by his love. We had never experienced love like that. We were all drawn to him and bound to him forever by the tremendous love that he had. And so that is the incarnation. So, and just let me mention before going on to the next part, that beautiful analogy he gives, that what I want is the milk, that is the essence. I don't want the whole cow, I want the milk, and the milk comes out of the udder. And the incarnation is the udder of God. The incarnation is the udder through which the milk of love and devotion, and also knowledge, but here he's emphasizing love and devotion, come. And so approach the incarnation, because there the milk is freely flowing, easily available. So now there's a break. Those of you who are following in the text will see that there's not just a paragraph break, but a space between what I have read up to this point and what comes next. That's because what comes next is another day. It's not the same day. Remember, this was June 25th, 1883, at Balaram Bose's house. But now suddenly it's a hot day in June 1883 at Dakshineshwar. And so probably what happened, I'll have to look in the Bengali text to see if it's any clearer. But this was probably a passage which had no date in M's diary. And so it's an undated passage. And so it was, because it happened in June 1883, it was put after this, as if it were a continuation, but it's not a continuation. So it says, it was a hot day in June 1883. Sri Ramakrishna was sitting on the steps of the Shiva temples in the temple garden at Dakshineshwar. M arrived with ice and other offerings and sat down on the steps after saluting the master. So June is a terribly hot month in Calcutta, probably the hottest. Here, we're used to July and August being the hottest months, but in India, the monsoons begin at the end of June, at least in this part of India. and up through the north, the Himalayan regions where Mayavati is, there also it happens that way. So the monsoons come in late June. And so from the end of June through July, August, and the beginning of September, you're getting frequent rains, and so that helps cool things down. Cool things down means cools them down to a bearable, intense heat. Don't take cool things down too seriously. It cuts the edge of the heat, the rains. But June, before the rains begin, is the hottest month. It's terribly, terribly hot. So this was a particularly hot day. And M brought some ice for Sri Ramakrishna. We know that Sri Ramakrishna liked ice in the summertime. I like to suck on pieces of ice. Master to M. The husband of Mani Mallik's granddaughter was here. He read in a book that God could not be said to be quite wise and omniscient. There's a note that this is a book by John Stuart Mills, who was a famous philosopher, thinker at that time, John Stuart Mill, rather. A famous thinker at that time who was very influential in the West in the 1800s. And Swami Vivekananda sometimes refers to him. He was a utilitarian. No, not utilitarian. I think a utilitarian. He didn't believe in God. But he tried to find a reason why someone should be moral without religious authority, because he didn't accept religious authority. And so he said that one should seek the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That is the motivation behind morality, that seeking the greatest good for the greatest number of people. As Swami Vivekananda said, that's not at all a motivation for morality, that short of spirituality, there is no real foundation for morality. Why should I seek the greatest good for the greatest number of people if I don't want to? There's no answer to that. So you can't say that that is a moral imperative. So anyway, coming back to the text, might be similar to Vidyasagar, yes. But it was a popular trend of thought in those days. So he says, the husband of Mani Mallik's granddaughter was here. He read in a book that God could not be said to be quite wise and omniscient. Otherwise, why should there be so much misery in the world? As regards death, it would be much better to kill a man all at once instead of putting him through slow torture. Further, the author writes that if he himself were the creator, he would have created a better world. So that's also a common thought. In fact, Swami Vivekananda himself says this on occasion, that if I had created the world, I would have done a better job. And once in California, somebody said something to him about the world being this beautiful place made by God. And Swami Vivekananda said, God has done a poor job. I am here to fix it. Something like one of those radical statements of Swami Vivekananda that inspire people like myself and infuriate some other people. So I can't remember. I wish I could remember the exact words that he said, because they were much more powerful. But that's the idea, that God has made a mess of things and I am here to fix it. So anyway, here, the idea is that John Stuart Mill gave in this book is that God couldn't be omniscient, couldn't be all-wise, because the world is so full of suffering. And he says that even if there is death in the world, even if it were designed to have death in the world, why should you make people go through long illnesses and suffer so much? If you're going to kill people, just kill them outright. Be merciful. Don't kill them little by little and make them suffer endlessly for months and for years sometimes of pain and torture before a person finally dies. So why couldn't this universe have been designed in a better way, where there's not all of this pain, all of this suffering, all of this ignorance? And so that's what Swami Vivekananda also meant when he occasionally said such things. And so one would expect now that Sri Ramakrishna is going to counter that and say, no, God is all good, God is all wise. That's not what he says. It's rather surprising how he handles this statement. M listened to these words in surprise and made no comment. That is, Sri Ramakrishna is relating what John Stuart Mill said in this book. So, Master to M, can one ever understand God's ways? I too think of God sometimes as good and sometimes as bad. He has kept us deluded by his great illusion. So yes, God has kept us deluded by his great illusion. Sometimes he wakes us up and sometimes he keeps us unconscious. One moment the ignorance disappears and the next moment it covers our mind. If you throw a brickbat into a pond covered with moss, you get a glimpse of the water. But a few moments later, the moss comes back and covers over the water. So sometimes we have a moment of clarity, a moment of understanding, and then again our minds are clouded by a delusion. And so Sri Ramakrishna is not refuting the fact that, yes, he says, sometimes I think of God as good, sometimes I think of God as bad. Sometimes we have moments of clarity, sometimes we have moments of great delusion and suffering. And he goes on, one is aware of pleasure and pain, birth and death, disease and grief, as long as one is identified with the body. All these belong to the body alone and not to the soul. After the death of the body, perhaps God carries one to a better place. It is like the birth of the child after the pain of delivery. Attaining self-knowledge, one looks on pleasure and pain, birth and death, as a dream. So yes, all pain and misery pertain to the body, and it's our attachment to the body which causes all of our misery. We may think that there are many different causes of our misery. There's a disease, there's economic problems, there are all kinds of things. All of those are experienced because we are attached to the body. If we could lift our consciousness above the body, then all suffering would disappear. All forms of suffering, that's important to remember, all forms of suffering sit on this. This is the vehicle for suffering. And yes, the vehicle for pleasures also. But those pleasures are always tied to suffering as well. The same nerves that carry pleasure carry pain as well. The two are tied together. And so Sri Ramakrishna says, how little we know. Can a 1 seer pot hold 10 seers of milk? Or we could say, can a 1 pint pot hold 10 pints of milk? If ever a salt doll ventures into the ocean to measure its depth, it cannot come back and give us the information. It melts into the water and disappears. So that two beautiful analogies. That in our limited minds, can we understand everything? No, we can't. We have a 1 pint mind. Can it hold 10 pints of milk? That is all of the knowledge that would be necessary to understand everything. No, the mind can't understand these things. So he says, he gives the example of the salt doll, which actually the first time I know of this appearing in literature it's an analogy given by Dnyaneshwar, the great Maharashtrian saint of the, I think, 12th century. And so Sri Ramakrishna would use this often, that if a salt doll goes to measure the depth of the ocean, it never returns. It goes into the water and melts into the water. It can't measure the ocean. It becomes the ocean. And so if we go to seek the understanding of all of this, by seeking its source in the infinite, seeking it in God, all of this disappears. This disappears, this disappears, all disappears. Then who is to understand what? And so the mind can't understand it. Now the problem for me, this is not what Sri Ramakrishna is saying here, but the problem for me is that when we look at the problem of evil and suffering and why there's so much suffering, why there's so much evil in the world and so forth, why we are deluded by ignorance, If we look at it from the standpoint of God as creator, there's no explanation. There is no explanation from the standpoint of God. That's the great weakness in the God-centric explanation of this universe. Because if we see God as the creator of all and the director of everything, then there's no way out of this dilemma that God has created our misery. God has deluded us, kept us in delusion, and created our suffering. So, of course, in the Hindu tradition, we bring in the law of karma and everything. Yes, that's true. So that it's because of karma that we're suffering. Yes, but who created karma? And who put us in, created us as beings within the mechanism of karma? It all comes back to God. It's all God's fault. So from the standpoint of the usual understanding of God, there's no way out of that. You can say that, well, God likes to keep some in suffering. It's all God's play, and it's all just for fun. Yes, if we can see that everything is just play, then we're free. But why did we have to go through this to get there? Why do we have to go through lifetime after lifetime of misery and suffering and pain and watching the sufferings of other people as well? There's no answer from the standpoint of God as creator. The only standpoint from which it makes sense, and that's adumbrated at least in what Sri Ramakrishna is saying here, is from the standpoint of the non-dual reality, that we are deluded, and we have to come out of delusion. And when we come out of delusion, we find that there was never any delusion and no pain. But that takes God out of the picture. So that doesn't mean that we have to take God out of the picture. It means that God as creator is going to bring us into this dilemma every time. Why did God create and put us into misery? One answer again is that you find both in the Abrahamic traditions like Christianity as well as in devotional forms of Hinduism, is that God wanted to have us experience divine love by coming up through the world and developing and becoming saintly and then loving God and so forth. It's to have us experience the love of God. Couldn't that have been experienced where we were when we were one with God? Why did this have to be created? And so you come back to the point that there's no way out of the fact, from a devotional or a knowledge-based standpoint, that we are here because of ignorance. That we're here because of ignorance, and the only way out of this ignorance is coming back to God. And so seeing God as the reality, and what we're seeing now as a result of our ignorance, yes, that in that way, the devotion, prayer, worship, all of that makes sense. But from the standpoint of God as creator, no, it makes no sense. Then we have to say that God is both good and bad. God does some good things and does some bad things. God gives us torture, God gives us pleasure. And that is not a God that many of us can worship. And so if we see God as the ideal, as the highest ideal, as the manifestation of infinite love and infinite consciousness, and we are suffering from Maya, we have to get out of it. But again, if we see that, God, if we look at it from the standpoint of God has created all of this, that's why in Vedanta it's not creation. God doesn't create us. God doesn't create the universe. All of this has appeared out of Maya. And within Maya, Brahman appears as God, and we appear as individuals. And so yes, the worship of God, the love of God, all of that has deep meaning, but not from the standpoint of creation. As soon as you have creation, you've got a serious problem that there's not a good way out of. So Sri Ramakrishna again says, how little we know. Can one seer pot or 1 pint pot hold 10 pints of milk? If ever a salt doll ventures into the ocean to measure its depth, it cannot come back and give us the information. It melts into the water and disappears. So the only place where we can seek understanding is in the infinite, is in God, is in the self, is in Brahman. When we get there, then the question itself disappears. We know everything, but the question about the universe and all of that disappears. Swami Vivekananda was very concerned about that when he was still Narendra, still going to Sri Ramakrishna, when his father had suddenly died and left his family in penury. They often didn't even have food to eat, his mother and brothers and sisters. And so Swamiji Narendra began to wonder about God. He began to wonder why there would be so much misery in the world if there is a God. And then one day, suddenly, he had a spiritual experience. We don't know what it was. We don't know the nature of it. We just know that suddenly he went into a deep state of spiritual consciousness, and there the whole problem was resolved. And when he came back to the normal state, then that remained with him. That understanding remained with him. But what it is can't be said. He only understood it when he went into that profound state where he was so frustrated and not frustrated. He was in intense misery at the misery of his mother and family. They had done nothing wrong. They were victims of a situation and suffering intensely. But it was in that state of a deep spiritual consciousness where he saw the meaning of everything. But that couldn't be said. At dusk, the evening service began in the different temples. The master was sitting on the small couch in his room, absorbed in contemplation of the Divine Mother. Several devotees also were there. M was going to spend the night with the master. A little later, Sri Ramakrishna began to talk to a devotee privately on the veranda north of his room. So who was that devotee? It had to be M. Sri Ramakrishna was talking privately to a devotee, and M knows what he said. M was that devotee. Sri Ramakrishna said, "It is good to meditate in the small hours of the morning and at dawn. One should also meditate daily after dusk." He instructed the devotee about meditation on the personal God and on the impersonal reality, how to meditate on both. And so, yes, this is the traditional teaching that the best times to meditate are just before dawn and at dawn. That's why in the Sandhya Vandana, one stands before the rising sun and says the prayers of Sandhya Vandana. So before dawn and at dawn, and then in the evening after dusk. Those are the two best times for meditation, where day and night are changing into each other. When nature itself becomes still and the mind is affected by the rhythms of nature, and at those times the mind is most receptive to meditation. After a time, he sat on the semicircular porch west of his room. It was about 9 o'clock. The semicircular porch is a very small porch facing the Ganges, for those of you who have been there. Master, those who come here, meaning to himself, those who come here will certainly have all their doubts removed. What do you say? M, that is true, sir. And M, of course, was speaking from experience because his doubts had been removed by the master. A boat was moving on the Ganges far away from the bank. The boatman began to sing. The sound of his voice floating over the river reached the master's ears, and he went into a spiritual mood. The hair on his body stood on end. He said to M, "Just feel my body." M was greatly amazed. He thought, the Upanishads describe Brahman as permeating the universe and the ether. Has that Brahman as sound touched the master's body? After a time, Sri Ramakrishna began to converse again. Master, those who come here must have been born with good tendencies. Isn't that so? M, it is true, sir. And yes, that is extraordinarily true. To have that extraordinary blessing of being born at the same in the same period and being able to come into the company of Sri Ramakrishna, what extraordinary karma that would require. Master, Adhar must have good tendencies. That is, Adhar Sen was coming to Sri Ramakrishna, and so he says he must have good tendencies because he was coming and had been deeply attracted to Sri Ramakrishna. That goes without saying. Master, a guileless man easily realizes God. There are two paths, the path of righteousness and the path of wickedness. One should follow the path of righteousness. That is true, sir. If a thread has a single fiber sticking out, it cannot pass through the eye of a needle. So that analogy is used to say that our character and mind has to be purified so that it comes to a point. Then it can go through the eye of the needle, that is, go into deeper states of consciousness. But if you're trying to thread a needle and the thread is splayed, or even if one fiber is sticking out, it catches as you try to put it through the eye of the needle. Master, if a man finds a hair in the food he is chewing, he spits out the entire morsel. But you say that the man who has realized God cannot be injured by evil company. A blazing fire burns up even a plantain tree. So here, yes, the Sri Ramakrishna says that if you're eating and you find a hair in the food, you spit the whole thing out because of the hair in the food. Wickedness, that destroys everything. It destroys everything. It's not just one little deed, but it affects your whole character. And so wicked company also has the tendency to affect us, or it does affect us. Even Swami Turiyananda once said, late in his life, he told others that, you see, even we are affected by evil company. How much more careful you should be. And but here Im says, yes, but you say that the man who has realized God becomes like a blazing fire, which even a plantain tree thrown into it is burnt. Plantain tree, a banana tree, is full of water. And so to burn a plantain tree, a green plantain tree, a banana tree, is almost impossible. But if you have a blazing fire and you throw it in, then the fire dries up the liquid immediately, and that too is burnt up. And so one who has realized God becomes like a blazing fire. And so that's what Sri Ramakrishna used to say about Narendra, the future Vivekananda. That Naren is like a blazing fire of knowledge. It doesn't matter what he eats, pure food, impure food, it doesn't matter. Everything that he eats, all impurities will be destroyed in the raging fire of knowledge which he is. And that similarly with Narendra, wicked company, nothing could affect the blazing fire of knowledge that was within him. So this brings us to the end of these 2 days under June 25th, the 2 different days that are under the same heading. So both days were very, very important, beautiful passages in both of the days. But that teaching is extremely important that he gave in the beginning, that through sincere prayer, everyone can realize the inner self. Everyone, without exception, can realize the inner self through sincere prayer. So we'll stop here. I'll give announcements, and then after the announcements, if there are any questions, I'll take those. Otherwise, we'll close. So for announcements on Sunday, I will speak on, and I misspoke on Tuesday night after the Gita class. I gave the wrong title for this Sunday's talk. This Sunday, it will be the birth anniversary of Swami Vivekananda, according to the Indian calendar, the Tithi Puja. And so we already celebrated his birthday near his solar calendar birthday, which is June 12th. But in India, his birthday will be celebrated this Sunday, February 7th. And so I will speak on Swami Vivekananda, his place in history, Swami Vivekananda's place in history will be the topic this Sunday. And next week, we'll have the Gita class and the gospel class as usual on Tuesday night, 7:30 for the Gita class, Thursday morning, 11 for this class continuation. So any questions? Yeah. 257, okay. Yes, yes. So, of course, as he sometimes said, when a person realizes the Nitya, realizes Brahman, many people pass away in that state itself. They enter that state and never come back. But if one comes back, then one should establish a loving relationship with God, the personal God, an attitude of devotion, and live in the company of devotees. So as he did, and as he taught to Totapuri also, who had rejected the relative. Oh, oh, so the question is, and I should have given context for those of you who can't hear what Surin is asking. He's asking on page 257 that Sri Ramakrishna says a man should reach the Nitya, the absolute, by following the trail of the Leela, and then he should come back down to the relative and live on that plane in the company of devotees. So why would a person go to the Nitya if one is to live here on the relative? Because one who goes to the absolute, and then because of prarabdha karma, past karma, the mind comes back to where we once again see the relative universe. One is still illumined. One is free. One has attained to liberation. One has attained enlightenment. And one no longer suffers any bondage. And one no longer sees themselves as bound by karma or bound by sufferings of the body and mind. And so by going there and coming back, we don't lose illumination. So by our present circumstances, we're living here in this world and we practice devotion and everything. We worship God, we pray to God, sing to God. Yes, we do all of that. But from a standpoint of ignorance, we're still in a state of bondage. And so we have to go there in order to get liberation. And then if we return, then to enter into a loving relationship where I know that I and God are not two different things. But in this realm of duality, when I'm seeing this realm of duality, it's the little self playing with the infinite self. As Swami Vivekananda says, I myself have divided myself into the individual and into the infinite self of God. So, okay, there's a question coming from the audience. Okay. A lot of people like the Sufi teacher as Eknath Tolle, etc. Are they realized souls while still live to talk about it? Teachers and Tolle. I've never met Eckhart Tolle, so I don't know if he has realized the highest. His teachings are very good. The things that he says, everything that I have seen of and I haven't read his books, but I see a lot of quotations of his, and they're all very beautiful. But I don't know if he has attained to illumination. Certainly, he has had some deep insight, because one doesn't get that kind of wisdom without having some deep insight. And it's more than just having read a lot of books and being able to repeat what one had read from the books. No, he's speaking from some level of experience, but what the level is, I don't know. So I'll give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anandarupam Bhaktanukampadhrita Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidhyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namama.